So we are going to get started. I'm super honored that we have John Paul Jose here with us today. So John's journey with environmental activism started when he joined a protest several years ago against the Yatina Hole project. Later in 2018, he set out to discover what steps India's politicians were taking to address the climate crisis. As one of the Fridays for Future youth leaders in India, now he's still a passionate activist, criticizing climate action and the lack of it from an Indian viewpoint, and especially how global warming affects India's forests and ecosystems. Since the spring of 2021, John has been a member of the Generation Climate Hub for the New York Times, as well as served as a youth ambassador for the High Seas Alliance. And without further ado, I will pass to John to start his presentation. And at any point, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat and we will do a Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Ashley, for the wonderful introduction. So I will begin my presentation. So it's on environmental justice, like a magic that we should be talking about, like we talk about social injustice, like we talk about climate injustice as well as. So environmental justice is something which we have been fighting like or striving for. So no, it's something more of like started with maybe like not in my backyard, and that kind of concept against the industrialization or existing discrimination based on people of color and people from low-income groups. That kind of transitioned into civil rights. So, but in global north or global south, the actual idea of justice actually concentrates on these three areas. That's like fairness, inclusiveness, and equity, because that is the general aim of when we talk about what justice should be. So this is a general picture of how like that kind of injustice prevailed across the globe, especially when it comes to countries like India or most of the countries within the global south. There was existing social injustice that was inherent within the system in which many of our ancestors were living in. That led to a kind of colonialism that introduced something called transformation of nature. So when we talk about transformation of nature, that means the environment in which we live, because that used to be natural, because that derived from natural landscape. We began our environment and we began our culture identity from that. The colonialism kind of superimposed a different kind of environment on the environment which we used to live, and began to transform that environment with the environment in which they were living in. That led to discrimination, resource exploitation, industrialization, development, urbanization, capitalism, and now we have what we call as climate crisis and environmental degradation. So throughout this transformation, people who have been living in that environment saw all those changes, and they are the victims of that injustice. So in general, what we call as environmental justice, it is a remedy to all those detrimental changes in the traditional environment and related interaction within the same. So when we refer to those detrimental changes, it means transformation in nature, industrialization, colonialism, and also the kind of urbanization and displacing people. And when we call about traditional environment, that means living in a particular area since the kind of human interaction with that nature, we began to settle in that area, and that nature began to provide a kind of livelihood opportunity. And with the constant engagement with that nature became the environment of that people. And gradually, as people began to settle in that area, culture, traditions, and kind of civilizations developed. And this kind of interaction continued for a long time. And when the detrimental changes, which I mentioned, the colonialism or that kind of external influences came in, these interactions began to change, and this traditional environment began to change into material environment. So these are some historic movements that India had seen over the years. So all those things, as I mentioned, were in response to those detrimental changes. So Bishnoi movement that was against logging of traditional trees. So people seen forest as a traditional or livelihood opportunity for them. But from someone from outside who saw this forest, they began to cut down those trees for construction, and people began to oppose. Similar goes to Chipko movement, where forest that was a livelihood opportunity was seen from an external force as a source of income or economic value. Similarly, the Silent Valley that sparked out of a hydroelectric project that affecting a livelihood forest. So this livelihood forest means people depend on forest for their livelihood. Like for instance, like people depend on cities for their livelihood, any job or living. For instance, if those things changes, then people have to fight against that because cities have been their livelihood opportunity. Similar goes to forest because that is like the first stages of human livelihood opportunity. Those things came from nature and forests. And the recent one again, another is Narmada Bachao Andolan. That's again large scale damming and displacement that again lead to impacting the livelihood of people and leading to injustice. So when we see like 100 years ago or like 50 years ago or even now, most of this kind of same because those things are the major areas that contribute to injustice. For instance, land grabbing, because I might be the owner of a land or I might be the tenant, but plantations and dams comes in, I am being displaced. So my identity, my environment, everything is being lost, and I have to live somewhere with like poverty or with some like some benefits from the government or some external force as compensation, and I have to live my life with that. In exchange, there's someone who have grabbed the land. They engaging plantations, construction of dams. They earn their profits, and they have a like clear future or everything, like the continuity in what they have been doing. And when others get displaced, they have no continuity. Similar goes for mining, for minerals and sand and other exploratory things. Same goes for fossil fuels. Exploring fossil fuels, confiscating land, then spilling from those exploration, then extraction, then infrastructure for fossil fuel transported, whether it's railway, ports, or even pipelines. So we know how the Keystone pipelines, all those issues are come within that, because while those pipelines moving, that takes away like hectares of farmland, residential land, and also like wilderness, like wild areas, like other species depend on. Then again, we have waste, that is incinerators. Like when we consider waste as an issue that is being littered across the globe, we are finding solutions to remove that waste. But through incinerators, the solid waste is being turned into air waste, that is solid pollution turned into air pollution. Then we have landfills, then fishing, nuclear energy waste, and another thing is pesticides, something like glyphosate that Monsanto all used to sell. So these things actually impact only like people of low income groups or people who are not rich or not affluent, and also people who are like marginalized, discriminated based on color or whatever kind of discriminated practices existing within that region. So this is a general picture of like how kind of injustice prevails. So if it's nuclear energy related, there are different injustices associated with that. That is uranium extraction, people getting displaced. Nuclear power plants, people get displaced. Then mining, there are also people gets displaced and their livelihood is lost, and wildlife species, everything's affected. Then waste management, infrastructure, then tourism, like for the case of like establishing ecotourism, all those projects, we kind of transform that particular environment into something else for catering the needs of outsiders. Because when we always think about environment or any actions or projects that comes in, the benefit should come to people or species that depend on that environment for their living. So many of these like development projects or all those things translate to injustice because who are rich or the industries. The project, the location, the area in which the project comes in, that has very less like benefits for the people living in there or people living in that environment, or even the kind of like species or the kind of all those natural interactions in general. That's why we have the environmentalism of poor, because like I said, in us, the socioeconomic insecurity are the ones who are being largely affected because they are dispossessed from their environment, from all those projects, their identity which derived from that land in which they were living in. Because for instance, like I will be coming to that, the crisis in Afghanistan, that's like people are getting displaced from that environment in which they were living. So they used to be known as Afghans. But when they have to run away, they have to be refugees, take asylum in any countries, then they are no longer Afghans. They're either refugees, or when they go to any other countries, they become citizens of people of that country. So either they might be German or they might be Italians or anything. And their Afghan identity is something which was in the past, and their livelihood, because they used to depend on the nature and the livelihood used to come from that. And with that interaction, they used to indirectly take care of the nature and environment. So those things are being lost, and hopeless future, because they had a clear idea that is evolutionary in nature, because we settle in one environment, we kind of practice a livelihood, then it carries for traditions and it continues from generation to generation. So that thing is being broken and they are being displaced to another area, and they have to think like what the future will be look like. Should they leave as Germans, or should they leave as Indians, or should they leave as Afghans, or should they look for a future? So then ultimately, if there doesn't get much recognition because they are kind of an outsider in a different area, so they have that general discrimination, they have to face poverty and other social miseries. So this is again the same thing which I used to relate major areas of injustice. One is land use change and diversion, other is air and water pollution, and other is agriculture. So these are the three areas that is directly related to nature and environment. And in all these areas, either people in power, rich, or industries are bringing changes that is fueling injustice. So that ranges from practices in rural areas that might be fossil fuel infrastructure, mining, or dams, or those things, or in cities like incinerator, thermal plants, or other things that comes up in the cities. So when we bring climate justice to environmental justice, that becomes something much more bigger. Because while we continue to focus on environmental justice or environmental injustice that comes out of have contributed to something called climate crisis. Now we have to ensure justice to the victims of climate crisis. So again, they are vulnerable communities. There are people living in India, people living in Africa, Latin America. So all of them comes within that, because they are already facing environmental injustice. They are already facing social injustice. And again, they have to face climate injustice. Because when extreme weather strikes, they're already in a vulnerable geography and locations, and they are getting displaced. And due to their socioeconomic insecurity, they have less privilege to look forward a future that is again self-reliant, or future that is more progressive or hopeful, so that they will be pushed back again to the same conditions that they were living, because already we have a lot of social upliftment or community development programs. And all those things are to ensure justice, like social justice. And with climate crisis, those progress which we achieved are going to be shattered and moving them back again to the lower sections of the society. So like I said, areas where environment or climate or social injustice prevail mostly are those areas dependent on nature. So one is agriculture, that is dependent on nature, traditional, rural, and they are small scale, and they have socio-economic variability. And with climate crisis, temperature rise is affecting cropping patterns and drought, flood. So all those things affect crops and their profits return. And so profit from which they live, because they have to invest in agriculture. And if there are no return, they're again going below poverty level. So their income they get from the agriculture activity depends on their livelihood or prospectus which generations or their children are going to enjoy. So if those things are again affected by climate crisis and injustice prevails, their situation is going to be worse. And I myself come from agriculture family, so it is a very difficult situation if we kind of lose that progress which from generations which we achieved, and if we lose our progress in the middle. That's why it's important, like resilience, adaptation, mitigation as the key to justice in agriculture sector, because when we have like climate crisis or environmental injustice, people should be adapted or people should be made to fight against that injustice and also to face climate crisis, because we already have a world heading to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. So across the globe, we only adapt or become to equip cities to be more resilient, but this rural area or people depend on agriculture, they are being downgraded. Same goes for coastal ecosystem. Depending on nature, fishing, then they are one of the high risk population due to their location, frequently impacted by sea erosion, sea level rise, cyclone, and also impacted by fossil fuel infrastructure. That is like building up ports, which take up fossil fuel imports, take it inland and transport to thermal power plants. So to channelize all those things, those communities living in the coastal ecosystem and those natural landscape is being changed. And there also, like I said, resilience, adaptation, mitigation is very low. In forest ecosystem, that is one of the traditional or one of the first major livelihood opportunities which we have in human history. And indigenous populations still continue to rely on these livelihood opportunities, and they are being impacted by deforestation that is being countered by plantations. So when we call plantations, they are one of the major things when it comes to restoration, because we call like reforestation as a compensation to deforestation. But when we reforest, that is plantations, that is like monocrop plantations, like either we plant invasive or non-native species like eucalyptus from Australia being planted in Latin America, or acacia or mahogany from Honduras being planted in India, or all those things are being coming up under the plantations. So it is an environmental injustice because we are introducing something that is not part of that environment, saying that will benefit that environment and species living there. So that is a greenwashing in the name of environmental justice. Then there is ecotourism. For ecotourism, we develop forest, then also remove a lot of people from those forest area, those indigenous people. Then we bring outsiders to enjoy those tourism infrastructure. Then we have mining, fossil fuels, transmission lines, railway, urbanizations. So like I said, all those things are being compensated with afforestation, because in all those cases, we just consider only what is being lost, that is the trees. We doesn't take into account the plants, species, or most importantly, the indigenous people who used to manage this forest sustainably. That's why there's a lot of greenwashing in this area. So the recent area of injustice, that is one of the major thing, is island ecosystem that is being fueled by climate injustice. So that comes out of rising sea level, then cyclones, tornadoes, then extreme other weather events. So those things are directly impacting the people of islands. So islands are sinking, especially islands like Tuvalu, they are sinking. So there is a great social injustice and ecological transformation for industrial needs within those areas, because these islands are being made as a center of tourism. And with climate crisis, these islands are sinking. So people have to, like I said, they have to either get displaced or they have to be taken, like airlifted or moved to some other place to live by leaving behind their identity, their environment, and their livelihood, which was all evolved from the environment and nature in which they were living in. So if Torres Strait Islanders get replaced to Australia, they have to live as Australians, practicing what livelihood opportunities Australians are living. They won't be able to live as Torres Strait Islanders. Similarly goes for people of Tuvalu. They have to live in somewhere else, not as Tuvaluans, but someone else. The next comes the Afghan crisis, where like when new systems come in, like outside their kind of lifestyle, a new system is being imposed. So with fear, people are becoming migrants, people are becoming refugees and seeking asylum elsewhere, because their only aim is to survive, that is not being shot dead or like be alive. So in that process, their livelihood and identity is being lost. And when entire people living this particular environment is being like deliberately displaced, or they're like out of choice, when they decided to leave their environment, that environment either degrades or someone else comes in and transforms that environment for industrial purpose, for mining or other needs. So in a way, when people of that environment, which used to like protect that nature or environment in return to livelihood opportunity that area provides, that thing is being lost, and the identity was coming from that region. So when they get displaced, their identity is lost, their livelihood is lost, and the future which they want to live in is also lost. So when we look to how we should work on for having a sustainable future, or what we call as justice, like how we could look forward for justice and how we should ensure that. So environmental and climate awareness is most important. So we should all know about what are the environmental issues that is affecting people and what are the things that contribute to injustice. Similarly, go for climate. What all issues are contributing to climate change and how injustice is being done. So with that knowledge, we know what to do, because if we have sensible and effective leadership, we can directly call for action. If those things doesn't exist, we have to fight for a system. That is, we have to use our right to protest to have a sensible and effective leadership. So that comes through kind of a purification process. We choose the best we have, and when the next election comes in, we choose for the best that is coming up again. So we have to face all the previous best we have chosen. So in that way, we have to ensure we have leaderships that are able to tackle those needs and those who could give us long-term justice. So there we have abilities to cooperate and collaborate, because when we have opportunities for cooperate and collaborate, we already moved from that phase of being on different sides. The government at one side, people at one side. So when we have those effective leadership, that provides opportunities for cooperation and collaboration, then comes actions and then justice. So what we have now is like we have a lot of greenwashing things, like we have work washing, like industry is saying like we are providing social benefits to people, but we continue to burn fossil fuels, we continue to degrade environment. Then people, everything going to be neutral when it comes to government. They act neutrally for people's benefit and also neutrally act for industrial benefit. So, but in most cases, latter are more beneficial. then asking to focus on individual actions. When we have protests of millions, they say like there are people bringing up innovations of cleaning up, so you should be doing that, you shouldn't be protesting. So those like putting those actions or burden on the individuals rather than the collective actions we required from government and industries. Then, like I said, greenwashing with tree plantations and cleanup. Then backdoor policy. That is where the governments negotiate and industries contribute that into the negotiations, but there is no voice for people, whether it's the young people or indigenous communities or anyone that doesn't have a voice. And things continue as business as usual and injustice prevails. So over the years, we have seen like how effective or where we have progressed. So most of the justice is being sought through legal measures, that is complaint or petitions, then public campaigns, march, protest, then media activism, and also influence of NGOs, then alternative knowledge, then blockade, objections, and it goes on with that. And the end product is boycotting of companies, because that is very like basic minimum thing which we could do. That is something which only like affluent or privileged communities could do, because we have large section of poor people in the society. They cannot boycott a lot of products, even if they're polluting, because if they boycott that, there are less alternatives, and they have to find or continue to use that with their bare minimum livelihood opportunities or bare minimum financial security they have, and refusal to compensation. Again, that is difficult thing. Like I said, all those environmental injustice happens in people who are very poor. So if they doesn't accept compensation, it's deliberate that they continue to displace. And if they doesn't accept compensation, then they have to be living in a different situation. And that's again affecting their livelihood. So most successful campaigns for justice stands with official complaints and petitions, and most importantly, public protest movements and engagements, and also disseminating information. So how we could, this is a general like progress of how we could deliver justice. Decolonization. So we have to decentralize, we have to de-imperialize or de-westernize and regionalize most of the things which we want to do when it comes to justice. And people who are privileged, they should actually talk and act on what all issues are impacting. Because if somebody is being impacted, we have to use our privilege to show that, yeah, we are being impacted, and we have to make governments and companies accountable. And when those things are in phase, we have to assist those communities to live with dignified life. That is, we have to uplift them to the next stage of their social life, that is providing socio-economic security and safeguarding them from any future threats. Because when we kind of uplift someone, we have to continue, like they continue to be like uplifted, and they continue to be living in a progressive world. So that's why it's important we have to safeguard. Yeah. That's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, John, for that awesome presentation. We're going to move into the Q&A portion now. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. You could also raise your hand, and we could call on you if you want to like unmute and share your questions as well. I see one question in the chat right now from Magdalena, saying that it's very interesting, this concept of need for both corporations and for collaborations to drive actions to face injustice. So Magdalena was wondering if there are any researches or like any research done, or like best practices on collaboration with corporations to drive actions against injustice.
Yeah, so the idea of corporations, which I mentioned, that was like when we have like, so in existing situations, now we are on two sides. Because we as people or activists, like we are on one side, then we have governments and corporates that are not ready to act. So to reach that stage, like either we have to be in government or corporates, or we have to make them do that. So for that, we need large mobilizations, or we need effective leadership. So if in some areas, if we have effective and sensible leaderships, we should have windows or opportunities to cooperate and collaborate with that leadership. For instance, Bhutan is more easy to cooperate and collaborate because they have more than like half of the country as forest and they're carbon negative. And if anyone wants to do more to that, it's very much easy because it's appreciable. And when it comes to US, if it was under Trump, there was less window for cooperation and collaboration. But when it comes to Biden, there is more cooperation collaborations. But that is not a sensible and effective leadership, because a sensible and effective leadership never continue to invest in fossil fuels if we call off climate crisis. And if we call about environmental injustice, then sensible and effective leadership never continue to promote ecologically degrading or environmentally impactful or detrimental initiatives. So we have to look forward for making people aware of this injustice. Then we have to mobilize and lead movements. Then we have to ensure that we have those leadership that could act, whether it is like someone who could act 20%, from that we have to reach 100%. So when we reach that 100% of like effective leadership, that is the area where we cooperate and collaborate, because we cannot cooperate with someone who have like 20% interest for justice and like other person for injustice, because there are still their favoritism is for corporates and industries. So we cannot act on that space. In that scale, we continue to protest. So when we reach that stage of like a leadership that we could collaborate and cooperate with, from that's a space where we act collectively and fight for justice. That's why we call, like all the scientists, activists, everyone call for collective action. That is, we have that universal like collective action, like everything we have. Like, but when it comes to real things, we doesn't have this unity. So that's what we mean by cooperation collaborations.
Yeah, thank you. Another question I'm seeing in the chat right now is from Elijah. How can effective change be made toward ending environmental injustice when the government is unwilling to act to help those who are poor or may not have a strong voice in the government?
So that again goes to the same thing which I explained just recently. So until and unless we get a voice or we get representations, we have to make people aware of it. We have to protest, and we have to ensure like sensible and effective leadership. So in context to this question, there is like two sides. We could make people aware of the injustice, and more people we could make them aware, and we could field a candidate or anyone who are from the marginalized or discriminated community, and we can include them within the system. Otherwise, we have to continue protesting, and we have to make the existing leadership sensible and effective and make them do actions. So that are the two things we have. Other than that, we cannot like become like more representative, or we cannot look forward to have like more inclusiveness of everyone. So that is only way we could bring more poor people into the system, more young people, indigenous communities, everyone to the system. So either we have to incorporate changes to the system, or we have to demand changes from the system. Yeah.
Okay, I'm seeing another question in the chat here, this one from Magdalena. So how can richest countries help the poorest countries to face their main environmental challenges?
Yeah, so one of this is like in nowadays, like for instance, like shutting down of coal plants. So it is like most of the coal plants are shutting down in Europe, and even the coal mining is being shut down. But those industries are coming to global south or poor countries. So to stop that, we cannot do anything. The only people of that country can do it. Because people of that country protested against those environmentally degrading industries that should not happen in their environment, but they are living that environment and polluting elsewhere. So that shouldn't be allowed, because we have to protect our environment, and we should also take care of others' environment, because environment, climate, everything is related. So if I pollute my environment and say it's my environment, it is impacting only myself, but it's impacting others' environment, even people of distant miles. That's why it's important, like how all those rich countries, because we have historic things like, for instance, in India as well, Bhopal gas tragedy, or glyphosate, pesticides being used, fertilizers, all those things comes from outside. So all those things should stop being traded to these countries into the global north, from the global north to poor countries. So one thing is like we have to protest with ourselves, and at the same time, people of that country have to tell the government or protest against the government to refrain from those like destructive practices. Like even many of you might know the Mercosur deal, which happening with Latin America and Europe, because that actually have a lot of injustice associated with that, because the benefit goes to industries and to the people in power, but less benefits for the people. So it's actually impacting people more. So we have to make people aware of those things, and people should actually protest against that. Then again, another thing is like providing finance, because from the global south, North have already extracted a lot of resources, like historically, like since colonialism, since those impacts everything, even now within industries, with all those fake social justice promises, still everything is being extracted. So those finances should come back here to actually uplift people within this scenario of poverty or all those injustices. Yeah.
The next question I'm seeing is from Helene. It is a clarification question on the chart that you showed that has a number of cases. Showed some cases for petitions, boycotting, refusing compensation. Did the number of cases refer to the number of successes, or were those just how often each action was taken? Yeah, I believe that's the correct chart.
Yeah, so it actually shows the number of times those things were successful. So we have like petitions and letters which actually became more successful than anything else. Then a public campaign, then street protests and marches, then development and collective actions. Because in all those cases, it shows the power of mobilization or collective actions from the people. When you go to the other side, it is just like boycotting companies. That is just something what like a privileged person or as any individual could do. That is very much easy, but it has very less impact and only less success, because that doesn't provide much of justice what we want to see. Because in this like official complaint or campaigns, those things are directly hitting those people or hitting those who are actually polluting or impacting. Yeah.
I actually have a question going off of this chart. When I was looking over on the right, it talked about the effectiveness of like shareholders and them pushing for more environmental action. I feel like in conversations I've had with friends or in classes, one of the big ways to try to drive climate action is where shareholders and investors push their organizations and the companies that they invest in to act on that, but it didn't seem very effective from your chart. Do you know why that would be?
Because like I think can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So when it comes to those shareholders, like there might be chances of like there might be few people who are shareholders, and there are other shareholders as well. Because like we need that percentage, right? Like 80% should agree, or like 50% should agree. So that might be the case, I think, because like when everyone agrees, then only changes will happen. For instance, like there are banks who are like working on shares, like different shareholders of banks. So sometimes the minority shareholders say about they are like withdrawing if you move this kind of activities. So, but that doesn't make any impact because the majority stakeholders, like shareholders, just continue to engage in those polluting activities. So that might be one reason.
I see. Thank you for clarifying that. I see Isabel has her hand up, so I'm going to pass to her and let her ask her question.
Hi, my question might be slightly vague, but you talked a lot about like countrywide change or even like regional change or government-wide change. But I was curious if you could talk about the effectiveness of sometimes just like local change or local movements, and whether you think that it's important to have both. You think that the local movements are doing enough, like that needs more help needs to be given to them. Yeah, I'm just curious in general about them.
Yeah, so by change you mean like change in government or actions?
Either change in local government or just like local changes in like the community. Yeah, just any sort of positive change, I guess.
Yeah. So when it comes to environmental justice, we need more like regional or local actions or changes, because like the environment in which that itself means the place around us. So if I want justice, like environmental justice, then I should be addressing the issues that my environment is facing. So for instance, the issues which I am facing in my environment is plantations, quarrying, then like sand mining, then rapid industrialization, then fossil fuel infrastructure. So those things are major things impacting my environment. But for you, it might be different. So when we fight for environmental justice, we are fighting for the environment in which we live, because that is something correctly or like more connected to the livelihood in which we interact, or livelihood which we have, or the environment in which we live. And in most cases, like when we saw talk between countries, in most cases in global north, those changes which we demand, because those things are affecting like more of the environment rather than livelihood. But when it comes to global south, that is directly affecting livelihood, then comes environment. So both the areas are highly impacted. That's why when it comes to environmental justice, we have to go more regional. And in countries like India, we have a local self-government with like power with them, and also large participation of people of that community or people of that local or region. So they have more power to do anything for their area, because, for example, if people or like 100,000 people of that area says like no to something, then that is a big no, because like you cannot bring up something for the for the sake of all Indians to that area where like the people of that area itself rejected, that 100% people rejects. You cannot call some projects in like in Alaska something for the national interest of US, because people of Alaska doesn't need that. So that is how we have to regionalize those environment movements. But when it comes to climate justice, it should be regional and it should be global, because it's an urgent need of the time. We need global actions. So why it should be region is like we have to uplift regional issues to international level. So regional issues should be internationalized to show it's the stake of that regional issues in the climate issues. So that's why we have to make that distinction, how or where we should go regionalize, or how or where we should be dividing the priorities. Yeah.
Thank you.
The next question here is from Elmira. So the question is, are there any immediate ways to identify greenwashing? Or is it only something you can tell with time and seeing that there isn't really a difference being made?
Yeah, so greenwashing is like we have like seemingly sustainable or seemingly friendly actions. So for instance, like when the major thing which we have across the globe is like acting on climate, and major thing is like cutting down our emissions. So when we have those targets, we have net zero, we have carbon offsetting, all those things. It's an idea of like greenwashing with vocabulary. Basically, if we kind of know the meaning, we know like in net zero, we could emit, and also we could absorb that emissions which we are emitting. So there is no restriction of emissions. Then carbon offset also means we can emit, but those things get offsetted. Now we have one of the largest carbon capture technology as well in place. Then we have companies greenwashing. For instance, Coca-Cola bringing up like 5% reusable bottles, but continue to provide polluting plastics like rest of the 95%. Or those the companies providing like youth-friendly or Generation Z products, that is with some stickers and saying this is sustainable. So just focus on generations who are into activism, more environmentally conscious. So they have to tap that business because like sometimes those who are cautious, they buy only those eco-friendly products. Then again comes when it comes to fossil fuel industries, like countries continue to invest in coal, fossil fuels like they used to before, but at the same time they continue to invest in solar or other renewables. Because like when we say like, yeah, we are investing in solar, wind, other renewables, but when we look back, they're also investing in fossil fuels. So how to identify those things are like, so like we have like something which is brought to us a mirror. So when we look into that, we see only those solar or renewables or sustainable products, all those things. But when we look back, we could see the actual things. So the same thing which I said about plantations, because we destroy forest, and as a compensation, we plant like hectares of forest. So until the stage of compensation, everything is clear. Like, yeah, we are planting trees. Yeah, it's a good thing. Yeah, we see it's a climate progressive. But when we look back, we see forests are being destroyed, and the plantations comes as compensations. Then we look back again, then we see a lot of these plantations are not native, because we have eucalyptus being planted in India or like Latin America, or we have like rubber or all those things coming up. Then we have like large monocrop plantations that doesn't provide any ecological or livelihood benefits. So when we look back, we have to see that real things. So greenwashing means to the mirror, they bring to us, when we look, we see only those sustainable things, and they want us to see only that. And the media itself also helps in that, because all those things are being hidden with the help of media and with the system that is in place. Yeah.
Going off of that, I would love to talk more about the environmental justice impacts around reforestation initiatives. Like who is doing the deforestation versus who is doing this replanting and making these like plantations of non-native trees?
Yeah, so in countries like India itself, like there are like various organizations that support the government's like plantations, because like there are like two kind of things. Like one is like as part of NDC, like adding additional carbon sink, that is like nationally determined contributions, which every country update to the core to stay beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there are like various things like cutting down emissions. So one of the things is like adding additional carbon sink through forest. So either the government planned with the forest department, or the government planned with any external agency. That might be an NGO or institute, any group that supports the government. So we have like two kind of actions. There are like NGOs that scientifically plant, and or institutes or governments that plant scientifically. When it comes to government, that is very minimum. Then there are like those like plants unscientifically. there comes like, we cannot call it a reforestation or restorations. That is just transformation. Like transforming forest into like cutting down a forest and transforming them into barren land, then retransforming it again into plantation monocrops. That is forest, like reserved forest being transferred into like agricultural land, then it will be easy for them to transfer it to the industrial land. Because like transferring what we call like a forest land to an industrial land is very difficult. But transferring agricultural land to an industrial land is more easy. Then again, we have like a lot of plantations being done as compensations. We kind of cut down millions of hectares of forest, and as a compensation to that, we plant some forest. But that again, like less impact for that environment. Because I might cut down forest in Alaska, but I plant them in Florida, because how could it help the people of Alaska? And then the planting might be, I plant secure trees or redwood trees in Alaska, but I plant pines in Florida. So those kind of things like unscientifically. And so those things are like very close environment, but when it comes to India, we have eucalyptus or acacia. Those things are not even from the continent or from this region. Or even we have rubber trees, all those things, which actually being planted by cutting down like centuries old growth forest and being replaced with that. That's why it's important, like how we see those reforestation or like the kind of planting ideas that we have to find out more of these things, because the best term that suits those things is rewilding. So rewilding means like we are like how the wilderness used to exist, we are bringing that wilderness. So in that space, the landscape, the ecosystem, then the species which used to live in there, everything is coming in. And we also move out all those invasive species or those exotic species which we have introduced in that area. Yeah.
Thank you for explaining that. I'm not seeing other questions in the chat. I think we have time for maybe like 2 or 3 other questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand and we can swap to you so you can unmute and share your questions. If no one else has questions, I have a question that I'd like to ask. When you were talking about agriculture earlier, you stressed the importance of resilience and adaptation. Could you talk a little bit about some examples of that or what that means?
Yeah. So like, for instance, like from Indian context, like June is the onset of monsoon. So like then we have like after like post monsoon, then we have then summer again before that. So all those agriculture cycle, everything is dependent on that. So people are yet to like globalize or industrialize those agriculture practices, because still people rely on those traditional activities. So when we talk traditions, like especially like agriculture, fishing, or even like forest livelihood, forests have less impact when it comes to climate change, like when it comes to livelihood opportunities. But when it comes to coastal or like fishing communities or like agriculture, like it's highly impacted. If it doesn't rain in June, then that is going to be a big problem, because like we cannot sow seeds, so we cannot plant anything, because that is something that used to be processed in traditions. Because all those things are dependent on nature. Because when climate is changing, that means a part of nature is changing. And with the changes, again, people dependent on that is also changing, have to change. And because to change is difficult, because those are poor people. And they doesn't know like climate is changing. It will be like permanent, or it is just short term or long term. They kind of plant, but sometimes it doesn't rain, it dries out. Sometimes it rains when it's about to harvest, then everything is being lost. Similarly, fishing communities, they doesn't venture out during June, July, this time due to heavy rain and extreme rainfall, extreme storms, because the sea is very rough. But what if it rains in summer? If the cyclones or storms are very much extreme in summer, what if like we have like more rain than what it used to happen? Then their livelihood is being affected, because they doesn't have those like forecasting mechanism or anything. Like they doesn't even know NASA, or they doesn't even know all those infographics. They have no mechanism to follow that, because they can't say like, yeah, the NASA has released statistics saying like you shouldn't go out for next 1 or 2 months, because they doesn't know that. Because they look at the sky, and if the sky is clear, they go to the sea. So that is the practices. And then when it comes to extreme weather events, like flooding or storms or even drought, then there used to be existing mechanisms to counter that, because people used to cultivate in flood region with embankments and sluice gates. So they manage the flooding. But with increased flooding and frequent flooding, it is difficult, because this flooding used to happen only during monsoon season. And those things used to be manageable because they have traditional knowledge. But if those things happen in off season, and if the rainfall is extreme, those things are something which even the embankment or sluice gates cannot prevent. So when it comes to cities, we have like large scale resilience, like flood control systems, flood management systems, all those things are being placed. And also things like more of resilience also being faced by installing different structures. And also a lot of mitigations are also being done by providing more amenities to the people of the city. But when it comes to agriculture sector, nothing is being done. There are no technologies to do early harvesting, or no technology to let people or know about what is the things happening.
One last question that I would love to end on is just, fighting for environmental causes and fighting for justice, environmental justice, take a really big toll on people, like emotionally, psychologically. Is there anything you've seen in your time as an activist, as an organizer, that has given you hope over the past couple of years or inspired you to keep going?
Yeah, so I follow kind of three kind of actions, because one thing comes up like individual actions, where all those sustainable practices or choices, everything comes in there. Then comes collaborations. So that is areas or projects, that is the area where we have more hope or more actions. Because that is something which we work with like-minded people, or work with people who are doing good, or work with someone who have or group where we have progressive actions. That comes activism, where sometimes we have be hopeful, sometimes we are hopeless, because we are asking for someone like government or corporate who can't deliver anything. So that is the area where we have more of anxiety or stress, because we are continuing to demand from someone who are not even listening to us, and we hopefully looking forward to them as doing something. So when they continue to ignore us or not doing anything, that gives us stress or anxiety, because we are asking them this and they're not doing this, or not hearing our demands or anything. And it's happening for years. But at the same time, when we look on the other side, as we as individuals, or we as a community or NGOs doing, that is where we have hope, because we restored forest, we educated communities about climate change, and we led a lot of awareness drives, or we launched a lot of sustainable products. That is where we are kind of stressing out all those anxiety and all those things into positive energies. So that is how we have to channelize and balance. So if we just focus on one side, where we have less hope, sometimes hope or sometimes no hope, then we are going to collapse, or it will affect us, because it kinds of shrink us, and our activism or kind of actions which we had to do will be less. Yeah.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing the things that have helped you keep going and that have inspired you. Thank you so much for staying up late to speak at our webinar, and thank you for everyone for attending our first talk in our Global Environmental Justice series. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, so we can wrap up. But again, huge thank you for your time. Yeah, just seeing a lot of thank yous in the chat. This was awesome. Our next talk, if you interested in attending, will be October 6th, and that one will be focusing on water rights and traditional owners in Australia. So you don't want to miss out. Hope to see you at another session in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. Bye.